Hello everyone and welcome to one more of my videos. Welcome to the fourth, I believe, fifth video where we read together this book, Homosexuality in Islam by Scott Kugle. We have already I have prepared two videos for the chapter where Kugle was approaching the topic through the Qur'an. We saw the first chapter where Kugle explained the reasons for writing this book. And today we will see, we saw also the introduction. And today we will see the Hadith, how Kugle approaches the topic of homosexuality in Hadith. I have to say that this is a massive chapter, it is a very big chapter, and justifiably so, because as we saw in the previous two videos concerning the Quran, there is little to no reference in the Quran about homosexuality. It's the story of Lot, which Kugle systematically and in detail showed how in his approach, in his understanding, in his interpretation, has nothing to do with homosexuality. It has to do with violation in general. But there is only this one incident in the Quran that some interpreters, not all interpreters, consider it referring to homosexual acts. Hadith, on the other hand, there is a plethora of hadith. And in this chapter, Kugle mentions how essentially there are 2 or 3 different hadith that have been changed or been narrated in different ways, different words throughout the centuries, I will say. And life proves, and my lived experience since I started these videos shows that most of you out there, when you want to justify homophobia, you do it through hadith. Very few have actually used the Quran. Hadith have informed largely Islamic law. A very small proportion of legislations and rules of Islamic law is based on the Quran. The vast majority of rules are created based on hadith. That's why hadith is important. Now, that being said, having stated that hadith is important and that this chapter is massive, I cannot unfortunately go in details about this chapter, but I will try to do my best, because I tried to make justice to the chapter, but it was a 6-hour long video. Nobody will watch that. So let's start with the first part of this chapter. This is a wonderful chapter for people who want to actually understand about hadith science in a very, I would not say short time, because it needs time. So in the first pages of critiquing hadith, which is the name of the chapter, Kugle goes into detail about what hadith is and what hadith is not. How was hadith recorded? Because most Muslims out there have this wrong impression that hadith were first recorded when Bukhari and Muslim started recording hadith. They also believe that Bukhari and Muslim, they recorded hadith so that hadith will not be lost. These are 2 huge misunderstandings, and they are not the reality. Hadith started being recorded much earlier than what Bukhari lived in legal manuals, in collections about law. That's how hadith started being recorded. Muslims did not record them in aim to not lose them or not forget. Muslims recorded hadith inside legal manuals to justify legal decisions. So Kugle shows how hadith started being recorded. It informs us that Bukhari and Muslim, in reality, they did not intend to record hadith so that hadith will not be lost. What they did is they created the first Hadith criticism works. Bukhari and Muslim lived in an era where everyone was quoting a hadith or hadith out of thin air for anything. It had to do anything and everything was justified on hadith. And that didn't make sense. And many hadith contradicted each other. And many hadith were not even ethical. So what Bukhari did was sit down, collect as many hadith as he could come across, and then judge which sounds like possible and which sounds like impossible. To do that, Muslim and Bukhari and Muslim, both of them, to do that, they had to have some criterion. They had to have some basis, like, okay, I will reject this hadith or I will approve this hadith, but based on what? The most common knowledge for lay Muslims out there is isnad, is the chain of transmission, that according to the chain of transmission, okay, which is the criteria that Bukhari and Muslim used. Kugle informs us of more criteria that they developed throughout time. So this was the easier, not easier, it was not an easy job to do, but this was the tool that they chose to employ. Later, hadith criticism protagonists, because we need to understand that Bukhari was practicing hadith criticism. He was criticizing hadith, okay? He was not collecting hadith for the purpose of preservation. So the most popular tool is isnad, chain of transmission. Classical hadith scholars, after Bukhari and Muslim, because Bukhari and Muslim were early, they developed more tools. So later scholars realized that, wait a minute, in the same, and this is something that those that they have actually read Bukhari, not the many in this world, you can see contradictions. So, for example, the age of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in some of the hadith mentioned, the traditions in Bukhari mention as age of death of the Prophet 63 years of age, some others 60 years of age. These two mentions contradict each other. So why did Bukhari put contradicting hadith into his collection? Classical scholars developed other tools, other criteria. Okay, that one thing that Kugle mentions, and I really like it, is that you see how these names, let's say I said Makbul, which is accepted, it's not reliable. Essentially, all of these Makbul, Hassan, are unreliable hadith that potentially are forgeries, are fake hadith. And what do I mean by fake? All of this hadith, all of these terminology of hadith, titles of hadith, mean that most probably the Prophet never said that. But you see how the names are very cute. It's accepted. Good. Doesn't say authentic. Which means what? In the consciousness of lay Muslims, that they don't bother too much to study hadith studies, and I understand that it takes a lifetime. They hear Sahih, they hear Maqbul, and they are like, yeah, good, so let's practice it. Whereas the title itself essentially says the Prophet never said so. So, also in this chapter, Kugle clarifies and gives examples of how some hadith were accepted or permitted to circulate, let's put it like that, because of probability of the Prophet perhaps having said that. We're not sure. It's not confirmed. But the probability is less that perhaps in some situations the Prophet might have said so. Overall, the chapter shows how basing or establishing our legal pronouncements on hadith is a very, 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 very unreliable methodology. And then he goes on to explain that because all this hadith criticism, starting from Bukhari and Muslim, and until today we have studies of hadith criticism. I have this book that, truth to be told, I paid it more expensively than I should, because someone I knew proposed it to me and sold it to me quite expensively. And later on, I realized that I could buy it online half price. But this is the honesty of Muslim men. Okay, so not all Muslim men, but some Muslim men. So this is from the 1600s. Oh, this is a collection of all the hadith that circulated in written form, and we, according to this scholar who wrote this book, are fake hadith. They are not reliable hadith, but they circulate in written forms, where in hadith collections and in legal documents, how the jurists are making laws, how muftis are making fatwas, etc. From the 16th century, 16th, 17th century. Okay, so hadith criticism is something that continues until today. But remember when at the beginning of the chapter, Kugle informed us, and I have here, so this book here is Imam Maliki School of Law. This was written for purposes of legal instructions, okay? It's filled with hadith. So what Kugle says is that when hadith criticism came to be, when classical scholars started criticizing hadith and rejecting many hadith because the hadith did not meet the criteria of reliability, it was a little bit too late for the ummah. Why? Because many hadith had become part of the culture, part of the daily habits, part of the consciousness. And no Muslim back then, I mean, even today, for God's sake, today that we have technology and we have so many books about hadith. If you visit a library, an Islamic studies library, and you see how many volumes exist about hadith studies and hadith criticism, you can read for months. And we make the videos, some of us, that we make the videos. And Kugle, people like Kugle that write simplified books that the average Muslim can easily read. All this knowledge is out there. Some of this for free. And still, lay Muslims will come and will fight with scholars, will fight with academics and say, oh, but you hate Islam and you want to destroy Islam from within. People want to believe what makes them feel comfortable, what is within the comfort zone. If you put them slightly off their comfort zone, they react violently, okay? So because this is human nature, and we know it from today, and that was always the case, hadith criticism came too late. Laws had already been established on hadith. The hadith had taken sometimes precedence over the Quran on the consciousness of people. How? Through the jurists, through the parents, and this is another big topic we need to discuss, about how many wrong things parents have been taught to their children that this is Islamic, okay? Anything from washing your hands and take care of your room and do your chores to whatever marriage matters and inheritance matters reflected on Islam. But some of them are not even Islamic. And I will read for you. Let me drink my tea. So let me read to you page number 85, and you will tell me, it's already 24 minutes, and you'll tell me, Sofia, where is the hadith about the homosexuality? Well, wait, Stana. Good things come in a process. Why? The reason Kugle dedicates half of the chapter on this topic that I already mentioned, and I dedicate time of the video, is because if you don't know the background, you can't actually judge or approach the hadith, okay? So, page 85, I read, and he says, Let us consider one of the most widely cited reports in Islamic literature on homosexuality. The Prophet was reported to have said, "When the male mounts another male, the angels are alarmed and raise a cry to their Lord. The wrath of the Mighty One comes down upon those. The curse covers over them, and the tempters surround them. The earth asks its Lord for permission to swallow them up, and the divine throne grows heavy upon those who bear it up, while the angels declare God's greatness and hellfire rears up high." This is the Hadith. The conservative medieval scholar Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, who died in 1350, I always give you dates of Common Era, cites this report in his book on love, but warns that its chain of transmission is very weak. Again, the term is very weak, sounds kuchi, sounds, perhaps it's not real. No, when we say the chain is weak, means most probably this was never said by the Prophet. The transmission doesn't lead to the Prophet. A later medieval Hadith scholar who was equally conservative, Kugle, emphasizes on conservatism because that means that these two scholars were homophobic, were against homosexuality, clearly against homosexuality. However, they had the intellectual integrity to say that, look, this is the Hadith, but we know most probably it's a fake Hadith. So, a later medieval Hadith scholar who was equally conservative but had no particular obsession with homosexuality declared this report to be an outright fabrication. Maudu. Maudu is the term for fabrication. So the first one who was obsessed with homosexuality was like, look, we can hate homosexuals because of this hadith, but we do know that most probably this hadith is not real. The second one was like, you know what? We know that this is fake. Someone lied about that. The Prophet never said that. Now, pay attention. We have the scholars. They did the job, okay? Both conservative scholars. Because if it was a progressive, you would be like, oh my God, you do that because you want to put your own agenda. They had no progressive agenda. Pay attention what happened after that. The scholar who publicized this judgment, saying outright that this was a fabrication, was Muhammad ibn Tahir Patani, who died in 1578, who was known as the king of Hadith scholars in his age and revived in his native South Asia a discipline of Hadith criticism, 16th century. He disparages these supposed Hadith through traditional methods of isnad analysis in his book with the title Focusing Attention on Reports That Are Fabrication. He rejected it along with hundreds of others on a myriad of topics. He disparaged the report even though it boasts an isnad leading back to Ibn Abbas, an esteemed companion who died in 686, who was the cousin of the Prophet and to whom are attributed 1,660 reports. When Kugle says report, means hadith, okay? Medieval scholars like Patani discovered forged reports but had no success removing them from circulation. Almost 5 centuries after Patani proved that this particular report was forged, it is still in circulation among Muslim communities. Hadith scholars could pronounce judgments on reports or transmitters, but had no means to actualize their judgment. Jurists, preachers, poets, and parents repeated the report without questioning its authenticity. Even in South Asia, where Patani exerted such influence and his books are printed and read, this particular report continues to be cited. In 1879, the reformist Urdu poet Hali echoed the words of the Hadith in his epic moral poem The Ebb and Flow of Islam, as he chastised Muslims for adopting what he calls the effeminate and pederastic ways of the Persians and thereby corrupting their moral fiber, which led to colonial rule. That's what led to colonial rule. In 1960, a religious scholar of the Deoband Academy, Mufti Zafiruddin, published an Urdu tract against homosexuality, 1960, okay, in which he cites these supposed hadith, despite his training as an Islamic scholar and official of one of the Sunni world's most acclaimed madrasas. Zafiruddin cites this report as a true teaching of the Prophet Muhammad without considering its authenticity, even as he notes that Ibn Qayyim, his source of the report, warned that its transmission is weak. In 1971, a second Urdu edition was published with no consideration of the authenticity of this report. His tract was recently translated into English in 1999. The translation including his use of this fraudulent hadith with no attempt made to assess its authenticity. This example illustrates how far contemporary Muslims have moved from their intellectual roots in the classical Islamic tradition while representing Islam in an increasingly ideological neo-traditionalist form. The example above is an extreme case, but not an isolated one. Patani also discredits the famous saying, "The Sodomites, Lutiyun, will be raised on Judgment Day in the form of monkeys and pigs." The Hadith scholar considered its isnad from Abdallah ibn Umar, the son of Umar, the Khalifa, and deemed it false. Despite its attribution to a companion revered for his intimacy with the Prophet and knowledge of the Qur'an, the scholar judged the report to be forged. The link between the report's content and its purported source was illegitimate, and the scholar suggested that it should be cited only to mention its inauthenticity and encourage its removal from circulation. What does Kugle mean here? The word lutiyun that is being used in this hadith was not used in the era of the Prophet. This is, something, a term that was developed much later in fiqh. So the term lutiyun developed after the death of the Prophet. So it could not possibly have been said by the Prophet. It could not have been pronounced by the Prophet because the language was not there to be used. Based on that, scholars have said, wherever you see a hadith that uses lutiyun as in the terminology, this is a fake hadith. This could not have been pronounced by the Prophet. So Patani here says, look, this should be raised, this hadith should be raised because it's very easy to understand that it's a fake hadith. It's a hadith that was created much later than the age of the Prophet, and should only be mentioned as a means of erasing it from the books. You shouldn't be using it. That's what Patani said, okay? Yet, we find it still in circulation. Mufti Zafiruddin cites it without discussing its origin or status, in order to condemn the homosexual man whom he calls Luti by writing that, and now we quote Zafiruddin, "The souls of these evildoers would be with the souls of the tribe of Lot, which in a very narrow and restricted place, and is greater in punishment than the oven of the fornicators." End of quote. This wild claim by Mufti Zafiruddin goes against the spirit of most classical texts that discuss grave sins or enormities, kaba'ir, in which heterosexual fornication, which is zina, is usually cited as a more atrocious sin than sodomy. How to account for these reports and their widespread use even after hadith scholars criticize the narration and declare them false? They circulate because they reflect the Muslim community's prejudice, even if they do not convey an authentic teaching of the Prophet. For this reason, they are cited without scrutiny by scholars as well as other members of the community. This insight also allows us to understand how and why they were forged in the first place. We can hear in them the voice of preachers in the generations after the Prophet died. This is a very valuable element for all Muslims to know and bear in mind. Yes, some scholars dedicated their lifetime in Hadith criticism, they wrote books, their work is there. They are being ignored because homophobic Muslims, they want to be homophobic and they want to believe that the Prophet was also homophobic. The next element I want to read from the book, again, I cannot read much, time economy does not allow me. I want to keep the video in 1 hour, 1.5 hour maximum. We go to page 91 and we read. In the meantime, Kugle talks about, again, isnad and criteria of reliability. And then he says, even if one did not throw out this whole category of reports, he talks about forged or fake or not very reliable hadith, it would not affect Islamic law, for that is built upon a different category of reports altogether. As mentioned above, the reports that address sexual orientation and gender identity may be grouped into 5 different categories. Category number 1, reports that speak of divine punishment and death. Category number 2, reports that in which God curses homosexuals. Number 3, reports that speak of criminal punishment by execution. So the first one is about divine punishment, the third one is about human punishment. 4th, reports that condemn transgender behaviors. And 5, reports that speak of cases involving historically known individuals who engaged in homosexual or transgender behavior. The two are not the same. And if you don't know the difference between transgender and homosexuality, Habibi, go do something else in your life. Go educate yourself. Islamic law is primarily built upon reports in the 3rd and 4th categories, which is criminal punishment by execution and condemned transgender behavior. We will see about Islamic law fiqh in the next chapter of this book in detail. The discussion of forged reports above suggests that hadith on the whole may inform us about the opinion of later generations of Muslims, but give no guidance about the words or actions of the Prophet. Then, Kugle in this chapter, I want to show you that, uses infographs, he uses these schematic representations to show us about hadith transmission, and he does some hadith criticism himself. He evaluates some hadith based on transmission and reliability, etc. Kugle does not take this information out of his stomach. He refers to other scholars, although he is a very knowledgeable scholar himself to be able to do it by himself. Page 94, this crucial point is made explicit in a variation of this hadith as recorded by, here we're talking about the hadith about Mukhannath, very famous hadith. I will read it in the following pages, but very famous hadith. Overall, a man who was born as a man and was raised as a man was dressing in a female clothing and was having effeminate manner. So he was living in the quarters of one of the Prophet's wives. Bear in mind the mentality and the lived realities of 7th century Arabia. Women were not accompanied, were not socializing with men, especially in their private quarters. So no woman will have a strange man, a man that she's not married to, in her bedroom, But effeminate men were allowed. So this man who was born man, raised as a man, but who was transgendered, was in the private rooms of one of, I think it was Salama, who was Salama. Let me see. Salama, one of the Prophet's wives. We know, I mean, I know this hadith for many years now. The whole story is that one day the Prophet entered the quarters of the wife, and another woman was walking away, and this effeminate man, the name for, first of all, in the era of the Prophet, there was a term for these people, Mukhannath, which proves what? If the language was there to describe it, then existed. So transgendered people existed already in the era of the Prophet. This is one element. The second element, the fact that this Mukhannath spent time in the private room of Salama meant that the Prophet was okay with that. The Prophet had no problem with transgendered people. And the Prophet permitted transgender people to live in his house, to spend time in his personal property, okay? We will see the controversies on how different people try to interpret it differently. But for me, these are simplistic. I mean, you don't need to be highly educated to understand that if the term was there, if the word was there to describe it, then this was happening in the era of the Prophet. If the story, the hadith exists, means that the Prophet was okay. So the Prophet was coming in and out of the bedroom of his wife, and he could see and greet this person and had no problem. So, you see, the story doesn't. If this was happening, and this is that's why here you see the transmission of this hadith, whether it's strong or weak. So we accept that this is a strong, is a valid hadith. So how could it be the other way around? But anyway, we will see the details. So this crucial point is made explicit in a variation of this hadith. This hadith has many variations, okay? As recorded by Muslim Ibn al-Hajjaz on the authority of Aisha, another wife of the Prophet. She was remembered to have said, and you see how beautifully Kugle uses the language. It doesn't say Aisha said, because we cannot be sure. He says, she, Aisha, was remembered to have said. If anything, the language that Kugle uses is majestic when it talks about sensitive topics. It's something that I need to learn from. So, let's see what Aisha is remembered to have said. There was a Mukhannath who used to be admitted to the presence of the Prophet's wives. He was considered one of those lacking interest in women. One day, the Prophet entered when a Mukhannath was with one of his wives. The Mukhannath was describing a woman, another woman, and said, when she comes forward, it is with 4, and when she goes away, it is with 8. The Prophet said, "Oh, I think this one knows what goes on here. Do not admit him in your female's presence." So he was kept out. This is the end of the hadith. In this version of the same incident, the narrator recalls the crucial detail that the Mukhannath, as an effeminate man, was considered one of those lacking interest in women. However, which, by the way, the language used in this hadith quotes words from the Qur'an 24:31, if you remember from the previous video. However, the Mukhannath's comment about another woman shocked the Prophet and caused him to reassess this assumption, the assumption that this effeminate man did not have sexual desires for women. And of course, right now, you don't understand what this 4 and 8 means and how this is related with sexuality, which is another element that we don't live in the era of the Prophet. We don't understand the nuances and the meanings of quotes and sayings. The chapter will explain later on. I will read it for you. But I make this clarification to make you understand that nothing is simple in Islam. Even the Quran contains so many such quotes or phrases, sayings that doesn't make any sense today because we live in a totally different era and we don't have these sayings. It's very interesting. You will see what it means. So, the Mukhannath, the Mukhannath's name is Hit, Hit, was describing the sensual body of the woman from Ta'if, named the daughter of Ghailan. The rolls of fat across her belly were so beautiful, voluptuous, that they appeared as 4 lines when she walked towards you, but 8 lines from behind, as wrapping around her flanks, they tapered out towards her spine. So it was, I don't know how we say it, maybe folds, we call it in English. In my language, we call it the breads. So it's these wraps of flesh that juicy women have, which you wouldn't understand it today because in today's beauty standards, a woman needs to be slim. A woman needs to have the body of a child to be considered beautiful, or at least until 2 years ago. This was the beauty standard. But for the era of the Prophet, a fleshy woman, a fat woman was a good woman. It was a sexy woman. So the mention of the rolls, the name is rolls in English. The mention of the rolls of skin, of flesh on a fat woman was sexy, was good, was desirable. So when the Mukhannath made this comment about this daughter of Ghayan, whatever was her name, the Prophet was like, whoa, wait a minute. That's something that only a sexually active male that heterosexual, has desires over women would pay attention. Why do you say that? So because of that statement, the Prophet was like, oh, most probably he does have desire for women, regardless of how he's being dressed. If he found that, if he made this remark, means that he desires women. That's why I don't want him to be in the private rooms of my wives anymore, because you don't know what might happen. So this is the whole story. The Mukhannath named Hit gave evidence of understanding heterosexual lust in great detail, and the Prophet reacted to his words with shock. There are 2 possible interpretations of the Prophet's banishing Hit and others like him from Muslim homes. Perhaps he reacted to Hit's inciting one of his Muslim companions to follow his heterosexual lust in a war raid, for Hit used his exemption from gender segregation to reveal the beauty of woman's body to prying eyes and possibly predatory intentions. So women could be relaxed next to this effeminate man, and he could rape them. Okay. By dressing himself as a woman, 1, he was exempting himself from going to the army, going to war, and 2, he was granted access to quarters of women, but by stating something lustful over a juicy woman, the Prophet was like, whoa, you're not safe to be around my daughters and my wives and my women, because you might rape them. A very big discussion that exists today with all these men out there that they decide one day to wear high heels and a skirt, and they have their beards. They're very masculine, but they're like, oh, from today onwards, I want you to call me Daisy, and I want to use the female toilets. And the outcry that exists that, look, women don't feel comfortable with you having a bulbul and coming in our toilets, because who is going to save me if you attack me in the toilet? Who's going to save me? So this is one of the interpretations, that this person, this Hit, maybe he was not really transgendered. Maybe he was just pretending. He was dressing up to avoid going to the army and to have access to women's private quarters. So the Prophet had to be like, don't let him into your houses. And when the Prophet said, don't let him into your houses, did not say, don't let him come into your house in your presence. The Prophet was, don't allow him in the private quarters of your wives, of the women, of the women of the household. This is one interpretation. The other interpretation. Perhaps the Prophet reacted to his evident knowledge of heterosexual desire despite his exceptional gender identity as a transgender man who was assumed to be outside of the economy of heterosexual desire, and saw him as not exceptional enough. This possibility is suggested by the one variation that remembers the Prophet as saying, "Oh, I think this one knows what goes on here," meaning that he knows about sexual desire and seduction between women and men, despite his being an effeminate man who is outside the heterosexual gender binary. The Hadith do not give us further clues about the Prophet's intention in banishing it from his household. The scholar of Arabic literature, Everett Rawson, who had best studied the phenomenon of Mukhannath in the first century of the Islamic community, sums up the situation by stating, Al-Muhallab explains that the Prophet only barred, this is quote, only barred the Mukhannath from the women's quarters, what I told you earlier, when he heard him describe the woman in this way, i.e., her belly wrinkles, which excites the hearts of men. He forbade him to enter in order that he not describe prospective mates to people and thus nullify the point of secluding women. It is not entirely clear then to what extent Mukhannath people were punished for their breaking of gender rules in itself, or to what extent such measures were taken rather because of the perceived damage to social institutions from their activities as matchmakers and their corresponding access to women. Essentially, none of these of the interpretations of this hadith says that the Prophet banished Mukhannath, transgender people, because they were transgender. That was not his problem. If this was a problem for the Prophet would not have allowed transgender people in his house to begin with. The only reason, because the hadith does not give us a justification, there are the reasons that the Prophet could have, after he realized that he could understand heterosexual desire, that has nothing to do with his gender, has to do with the possibility that he was lying about his sexual inclination, or even if he was not lying, by stating such juicy things, it was kind of immoral. It was kind of, you are here to keep company and spend some time. You're not here to sexually describing people. So this was kind of, but the point has nothing to do with the sexual identity of this person. It has to do with his impact or potential impact or lying. What are we going to read now? Okay. Page 96. To illustrate these stakes, let us return to the original event that generated these variously remembered reports. The Mukhannath he'd once welcomed in the Prophet's household as a valuable addition to his wife's social life was banished from Medina. There are some variations of this hadith which says that, not only the Prophet was banishing Heath and other transgender people from the company of the women, but was banishing them from Medina or sending them in the desert, that these people, the transgender people, could come back to the society once per week to find food, etc. Actually, I will not go into that. There is one point that there is one of the versions of the hadith, because this is the original or the most reliable version, the version that I read to you from Aisha, and then there are many other variations, which one of course could think that did these variations develop later on assumption. Remember at the beginning when I mentioned to you that some hadith are based on the assumption that the Prophet could possibly have said that. Beyond that, in one of these variations mentions that some of the transgender people started living outside the city and coming in once in a while for for food, for supplies. And then some of the Prophet's companions asked if it was better to kill the Mukhannath. Then the Prophet is reported to have said, I have been forbidden to kill those who pray. Why is this mentioned in this chapter about homosexuality? Remember in chapter 1, which is the second video of the series, the video that YouTube has put as above 18. The reason that it has been deemed above 18 on YouTube is because in this chapter, and therefore in the video, Kugle mentions cases of killing homosexuals very casually. He talks about Morocco, but we know that this happens in every Muslim majority country. So the Prophet himself said, I'm not going to kill someone who prays just because of their sexual orientation. However, Muslims today seem to have forgotten. I mean, they remember the rest of Hadith, but such elements of Hadith, they were not, their tummy was hurting when these Hadith were taught at school. Kugle continues explaining to us how many Hadith are ambiguous, and so there is one Hadith. Let's read that. There is one Hadith where the Prophet said that, they will be cursed those who do the acts of Lot. And then Kugle expands, explaining that by that, the Prophet did not mean homosexual activity. The Prophet meant disrespect to Lot and violence, sexual violence towards men, which is what we analyzed what Kugle analyzed in the previous chapter about the Qur'an, the two videos that I have. I will not repeat it because there's no point repeating something. You can go to the other videos and check. Something important here. Okay, let's read that. That relates to Ali. So, when we apply these insights about reliability, isnad, etc., when we apply these insights to the reports in which Muslims are commanded to punish men for homosexual intercourse, we find that there is no hadith about the Prophet actually punishing a known person in an actual historical event. Rather, the only context-rich report of punishment is khabar, a report about the companions of the Prophet. Khabar are the hadith that they don't relate, they don't go back to the Prophet. They stop in one of the companions when it comes to this isnad. This khabar recounts an event that happened shortly after the Prophet's death, when Abu Bakr had become the first vice-regent. During military operations, a commander named Khalid ibn al-Walid wrote back to Abu Bakr in Medina, announcing that he had found a man in some outlying region who does the deed of the tribe of Lot. So he had found one homosexual man, and this was big news. He had to send a letter to Abu Bakr, the Khalifa. Abu Bakr gathered the leading companions of the Prophet. They debated the issue because it appears that none of them knew of a precedent for such a phenomenon. The fact that Abu Bakr had a meeting with Omar and the other Ali and the other high-class companions, the famous companions for us today, it proves that, yes, there is no hadith mentioning that the Prophet actually punished someone, and there was no precedent. The Prophet never punished anyone, because if the Prophet had punished someone, Abu Bakr wouldn't need to have a meeting to consult the other companions to make a decision about that. The precedent would have been there. In the end, Ali asserted that in the Quran, God destroys the tribe of Lot by raining down on them burning stones. And so suggested that Muslims should punish the man by burning him. The council consented to Ali's suggestion and Abu Bakr ordered the man burned. Some versions of this report even preserve the name of the man punished as Al-Fuja'a, but the report gives no more information about his identity, the fate of his sex partner, or the context in which this event happened. Parenthesis in what we discuss here. Do you see that the early companions and even the Prophet himself, peace be on him, they had democratic ways to make decisions. We have many incidents or traditions where the Prophet was consulting his companions to make military decisions, etc. And we see that the companions were having meetings to agree on things. So that's good to remember when we talk about democracy and how Islam is against democracy. Well, Muslims today have made democracy to be something impossible. Islam was meant to be democratic, but like many other things that Islam was meant to be and is not today. We continue, page 100. Later generations with a mind. Oh, the incident I read to you is late page 98, the last paragraph, and pages 98, 99. Now we go to page 100. Later generations with a mind of legal logic argued that the punishment for sexual intercourse between two men is analogous to adulterous sexual intercourse between a man and woman. Thus, they disparaged the early consensus of burning and argued for punishment by stoning analogous to the punishment for heterosexual intercourse without a contract. And why Kugle writes majestically if you know how to pay attention to what he writes. He says without a contract, meaning without marriage or without being owned. Because in most books today, you will say, oh, zina is sex outside marriage. Where back then, men could have sex with their slaves as well, not only their wives. So there was, not all sex outside marriage was zina, and no sex with slave automatically meant marriage. But these are the nuances, the things that, anyway, I will not continue. I will not complain too much today. The punishment for heterosexual fornication was death by stoning if the accused was married and lashing if the accused was not married. The earliest source of hadith are actually legal manuals like Al-Muwatta of the jurist Malik ibn Anas, who died in 795, which is this book. Composed about a century and a half after the Prophet died. They record the fact that followers, the second generation after the Prophet in Medina, argued for punishment by execution but not by burning, and later specified execution by stoning in order to conform to the analogy with fornication. Then again, Kugle goes into another I will read for you the hadith. The hadith says, you should kill the doer and the one done to, meaning those who do the act of the tribe of Lot. And whoever commits it with a domestic animal, kill him and kill the animal. And then he gives us different variations, different mentions, some studies, and again another, you see here, a visual analysis of Isnad and who said what. He does a very good job when it comes to the hadith. Again, it's a huge chapter. In page 110, he starts discussing how hadith should be debatable and how are debatable, how today we can debate on this hadith, how we can prove that they are not real, they are fake. They are created much later than the Prophet, especially those that they contain these terms I told you, luti, etc., which did not exist as a term in the era of the Prophet. So all of these of you that you Google or you ask ChatGPT to give you about hadith, and you send me, because you have done it already, you send me a list of hadith. Yeah, these hadith exist, but are these reliable? Can we rely on them, especially on matters of killing someone or imprisoning someone? We saw that the subchapters are a tradition of debate and tradition of ambiguity. Then we go to page 118, tradition of misapplication, and then we read about a report. Ikrimah has said that Ibn Abbas reported that the Prophet said, God cursed whoever sacrifices an animal to a deity other than God, and God cursed anyone who alters the boundaries of the earth, and God cursed anyone who conceals the path for the blind, and God cursed anyone who insults his parents, and God cursed anyone who lords over those who are not his slaves, and God curses anyone who does the deed of the tribe of Lot. And God curses anyone who does the deed of the tribe of Lot. And God curses anyone who does the deed of the tribe of Lot. This is the report. According to the report, the Prophet repeated the last phrase 3 times, a common expression in Hadith for emphasis. So this is one of the Hadith we have. Again, Kugle goes into the visible analysis of this Hadith. And we continue. What do these items have in common that they should appear together in a list? All actions in the list are immoral transgressions that either infringe upon the rights of God, like sacrifice animal to anyone other than God, or injure others, like blocking the road or hiding the road for the blind. The focus of our analysis is on the last item of the list, the deed of the tribe of Lot. We have observed that many hadith transmitters assume that this deed is same-sex intercourse, specifically anal penetration between men. Certainly, by the time hadith were used in making legal decisions and later as the Sharia was formalized, about which we will speak in the next chapter, the deed of the tribe of Lot was defined by a technical term, lutiya or liwat, which left no ambiguity that anal sex was the meaning. Jurists fashioned the term lesser liwat to discuss a man's anal penetration of a woman. If we disregard for the moment the sexual interpretation given to this phrase by later interpreters and view it only in the context of this hadith, there is nothing intrinsic in the report. Again, Kugle uses the word report. When I say hadith, he says report. To encourage us to see the deeds of Lot's tribe as involving sex. So again, this sentence, there is nothing intrinsic in the report to encourage us to see the deed of Lot's tribe as involving sex. As we fully investigate its context, this appears to be a misapplication of the report to support a legal ruling. We observed in chapter 2, the 2 previous videos, if you haven't watched them, watch them, that sex acts were only one facet of the tribe's rebellion against Lot and his prophetic message. How one understands the meaning of the deed depends upon how one interprets the Qur'an's narration of the story of Lot and the conflict with his tribe. Lot criticized their worship of other gods, their murderous domination of trade routes, and the rejection of his own prophetic mission, in addition to the attempt of the part of some powerful men of the tribe to rape his male guests. Again, extensively analyzed in the 2 previous videos. It was never about loving intercourse between homosexual men. It was raping, it was violence, it was sexual activity used as weapon to harm other men. I will not continue. Kugle continues in good 6-7 pages about analyzing this hadith and proving that yes, even if this hadith is reliable, when God mentions the actions of the tribes of Lot, does not mean loving homosexual activities. It means violence, disrespect. Because every other, I mean, in this hadith, every other action that the Prophet allegedly put in this chose to group with the acts of the people of Lot are actions that have nothing to do with sex. Which, if we accept that this hadith is reliable, that proves that even the Prophet's interpretation of the Qur'an about the people of Lot was about transgression, violence. It was not about intercourse itself. So, okay, a little bit more than 1 hour. I hope I covered the main points. The chapter mentions all possible variations and all possible hadith that I have seen people circulating against homosexuality, and shows us how these hadith either are fake. Someone made them much later than the Prophet, and we know it because of their language, or they don't have good isnad, or whatever. So, and also as I mentioned, as I read in details, this hadith had been established in the ethics of the Muslims much earlier than when scholars started criticizing hadith criticism, starting from al-Bukhari and until today, which means that even for an hour now, I'm telling you about all these tools, all these details of hadith, and still I will have some of you putting comments underneath and saying, oh, but the hadith, how dare you talk about the hadith? Well, and the proof is what? This book is written for 15, how many years is now? Let me see. Yeah, 15 years. We go to 16 years. And still people demonize this book, that this book is trying to destroy Islam. People want to hear whatever makes them feel comfortable. So that was all for today. In the next video, which hopefully will be at the beginning of December, we will check the next chapter, which is the one before the end, I guess. Yes. And we will see how Islamic law, which Kugle called Sharia, but I disagree with that, but that's my disagreement, how Islamic law has been formed to decide to punish homosexual acts, or it doesn't punish the acts, homosexual people. We did get a glimpse from today, but we will see more in the next video. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to discuss, leave them under the video to prepare for the Q&A at the end of the book. You're very welcome to participate in the Q&A session. To do that, you have to be a member, so check the membership options of the channel, and hopefully I will see you in the next video. Until then, from me,